By the time I reached the glass tower of Asteron Health Systems, the city was still yawning awake, and the lobby smelled like coffee, lemon polish, and expensive panic. Panic has a scent in corporate offices. It smells like printer toner, forced smiles, and someone saying, "We should circle back," while quietly setting a match to your career. My name is Liv. At 36, I was Senior Operations Finance Manager for the outpatient division, and which meant I spent my days translating chaos into charts and explaining to doctors why budget discipline was not a personal attack. My boss, Dr. Sella Voss, was the medical director of the division. Mid-40s, polished as a magazine cover, voice like silk over steel. She knew how to command a room, charm donors, and make weak ideas sound visionary. She also had a hobby of leaving fingerprints nowhere. We had just closed the ugliest quarter of the year. Costs were up. Staffing overruns were glaring. A flashy expansion plan had eaten cash like a bonfire eats dry leaves. Everyone in finance knew the wound had a name, and it was not mine. Sella had pushed for agency staffing, premium vendor contracts, and a rushed satellite clinic launch, despite repeated warnings from my team. Every warning had been documented. Every forecast had been sent. Every reply from her had some elegant version of proceed. Then, sometime in the early morning on a Monday, my inbox received a board packet draft. I opened it, skimmed page after page, and felt my pulse go cold in a very orderly way. Under a section called Operational Variance Analysis, there it was. A neat paragraph suggesting that inaccurate forecasting from finance had delayed corrective action and distorted decision-making. My forecasting, my team, my work, tied up in a satin bow and offered to the board as the reason the quarter had gone sideways. It was almost artful. Almost. I leaned back in my chair and read it again. Then a third time, because betrayal is rude enough to deserve proofreading. Mina from legal knocked once and stepped into my office holding a mug that said, "I object to your tone." Mina was tiny, sharp, and looked permanently amused by human nonsense. "You have the face," she said. "What face?" "The one that says someone thinks they are smarter than metadata." I turned my screen toward her. She read the paragraph, snorted once, and sat down without being asked. "That is bold," she said. "Also stupid? Do you want comforting lies or useful strategy?" "I do not have patience for comforting lies." "Excellent. Then do not argue emotionally. Build an evidentiary coffin and let her climb into it." That was Mina. Not warm, exactly, but wonderfully nourishing. I spent the rest of the morning pulling source files, archived emails, staffing approvals, vendor signatures, and budget variance notes. The board meeting was set for later that week. Sella had moved fast, which told me two things. She was afraid, and she thought I would react the way cornered people often do. Loudly, publicly, messily. She wanted me to become the story. I had no intention of giving her that pleasure. By midday, Jonah from internal audit stopped by. Jonah was one of those rare corporate men who did not confuse volume with authority. He reviewed controls, loved clean trails, and treated spreadsheets like sacred texts. "Rumor says Voss is preparing a blame parade," he said. "Rumor is underperforming. It is not a parade, it is a solo." He almost smiled. "Need me to verify timestamps and approval chains?" "Yes," quietly. He nodded. My favorite kind of truth. Over the next 2 days, the picture sharpened. Every staffing overage had followed a direct approval from Sella or her deputy. Every vendor increase traced back to contract amendments my office had flagged in writing. The satellite clinic launch had been projected to miss margin targets before it opened. I had sent the analysis. Sella had answered with one line: "We cannot govern by fear." Lovely sentence. Shame about the math. By the eve of the board meeting, I had a clean binder, a digital backup, and a private calm that felt almost glamorous. Sella passed me in the corridor that afternoon in a cream suit that probably cost more than my first car. "Ready for tomorrow?" she asked. I smiled. "Very." She mistook that for surrender. That was her last comfortable moment. The boardroom sat on the top floor like a temple built by consultants. All glass, pale oak, and chairs designed to remind everyone that power does not need cushioning. By the time I took my seat near the end of the long table, the directors were filtering in with their tablets, paper folders, and expressions of practiced concern. Sella arrived late enough to be noticed and early enough to seem important. She placed her folder down, greeted everyone by name, and gave me a brief glance that said she had already written my obituary in executive language. I adjusted my notebook and said nothing. There is a kind of woman in corporate life who survives by becoming louder than the lie told about her. I understood the temptation. I had imagined it the night before, standing up, cutting through the nonsense, announcing with magnificent fury that our esteemed medical director had driven the quarter off a cliff while blaming the map. But fury is expensive, and I had learned to invest better. The board chair, Dana Rill, opened the meeting. Dana was a former banker with silver hair, merciless posture, and a habit of listening so hard people confessed things they had not planned to say. I respected her, which is different from liking someone. She moved through the opening agenda quickly. Clinical quality, patient satisfaction, recruitment, then the quarter. Sella stood. If confidence could be bottled, she would have sold it at luxury prices. She clicked to the first slide and began with a polished summary of market pressure, reimbursement strain, labor volatility, and the usual parade of external villains. Weather was not on the slide, but I assumed she would get there if given time. Then she pivoted. Several corrective actions were delayed by incomplete forecasting from divisional finance, she said. Leadership did not receive a sufficiently urgent picture of the operational variance until late in the quarter. I wrote down her exact words. Not because I needed them. Because I wanted to remember how casually people gamble with another woman's livelihood. Sella continued, voice smooth as polished stone. I take responsibility for acting on the information available to me, but the financial modeling was not positioned for speed. There it was. A masterpiece of executive evasion. She took responsibility for acting, not for choosing. For motion, not judgment. If cowardice wore pearls, it would sound exactly like that. Around the table, a few directors nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly. More the bored reflex of people who have heard this genre before. Blame finance, blame process. Blame the translation, never the speaker. Dana turned to me. Liv, do you want to respond? The room shifted. That was the opening Sella wanted me to take. A neat little trap door. Say too much. Sound defensive. Show anger. Look unstable. Women in offices are still charged extra for visible frustration. I folded my hands. I do, I said. But I would prefer to respond with the underlying record rather than impressions. Silence. Beautiful silence. Dana nodded once. Proceed. I connected my laptop to the display. My first slide was offensively plain. No branding flourish. No dramatic color scheme. Just a timeline with approvals, dates, and variance forecasts. The sort of slide that does not flirt with anyone because it already knows it is right. This is the staffing variance sequence, I said. My team issued written warnings before each threshold increase. The approvals for agency expansion came from divisional leadership. I clicked. Email excerpts appeared with dates and sender lines. Not full paragraphs, just enough. The warning, the recommendation, the reply authorizing continuation. I clicked again. Vendor amendments, contract add-ons, premium service escalators, each paired with my team's projected impact and the authorization that overrode caution. Across the table, one director sat forward. Another took off his glasses and cleaned them, which is what people do when the story in front of them becomes more interesting than the one they were sold. I did not look at Sela. I did not need to. I could feel the temperature changing beside me. Then I reached the satellite clinic slide. This launch was modeled as margin negative under the approved timeline, I said. That was communicated before opening. Dana leaned toward the screen. Was the board told that at approval stage? I let the question breathe for half a second. No, I said. Not in the materials I reviewed. That was when Sela finally interrupted. That is misleading, Sela said, with the strained brightness of someone smiling through a house fire. Those models were preliminary and did not reflect final operational assumptions. I turned toward her at last. Calm is a form of theater too, and I had rehearsed mine well. They reflected the assumptions provided to finance at the time, I said. And the revisions requested by your office increased projected loss exposure, not reduced it. Mina, seated along the wall as counsel, lowered her gaze to hide a smile. I loved her a little for that. Sela straightened. This is a selective presentation. Jonas spoke up from the back of the room where audit had been invited for the quarterly review. The timestamps and approval chain were independently verified. His voice was mild, which made it land harder. Dana looked from him to me, then back to the screen. Continue, Liv. So I did. I showed the board the pattern rather than the drama. That is the trick adults often miss. Drama is memorable, but pattern is convicting. One bad choice can be explained away. A sequence becomes governance failure, staffing overage, approved despite warning. Vendor escalation, approved despite margin impact. Clinic launch acceleration, approved despite loss projection. Then the final slide, my favorite. The board packet draft itself with tracked revisions from the night before distribution. Legal had preserved the version history. The sentence blaming incomplete forecasting had not appeared in earlier drafts. It had been inserted after finance had submitted its final analysis, inserted manually, by Sela. The room went still enough to hear fabric move. Sela did not speak right away. That was wise. Every bad liar has a moment where silence is the best performance available. Dana broke it. Dr. Voss, did you add this language? Sela inhaled once. I clarified the narrative for context. That sentence nearly made me laugh, and it was a terrible moment for laughter, so I turned it into a sip of water. Dana did not return the courtesy of pretending. Context is not the same as redirection. Another board member, Ruth Pell, a retired judge with a stare like winter pavement, tapped the packet. Why was the board not informed that the loss projections were known before these decisions were made? Sela shifted. We were balancing growth priorities against conservative modeling. There it was again. The elegant disguise. Not reckless. Bold. Not concealed. Balanced. It takes real skill to dress negligence in leadership language. I spoke only when asked. That was important. Let the board do the discovering. People trust truth more when they feel they found it themselves. Dana asked me whether finance had recommended mitigation options. I showed the memo. Reduced agency exposure, phased hiring, renegotiated vendor terms, delayed launch milestones. All written, all ignored. Ruth asked whether any forecast had ever hidden the severity. I showed the red flag summary page. Not only had it been visible, it had been impossible to miss unless one was committed to missing it. The questioning turned. Not toward me, past me. Sela answered more sharply with each round, in which is another common executive error. Pressure does not create character, it introduces it. At one point she said, "Finance always sees risk. It is the job of leadership to move beyond caution. I wrote that down too, not because it mattered for the meeting, because someday it might amuse me over wine. Then Dana requested a brief recess. As the board members stepped out, the room exhaled. Sella remained standing, both hands on the table. Her face was composed, but only in the way a vase is composed right before it topples. "You set this up," she said quietly. I closed my binder. "No, I documented it." Her jaw tightened. "You could have brought concerns directly to me." I looked at her, really looked at her, and marveled at the audacity. She had tried to nail my name to her quarter like a decorative plaque, and now wanted to discuss communication style. "I did," I said, repeatedly. Mina rose and gathered her papers. "I would stop speaking now if I were you, Dr. Voss. Silence is having its best day." That was when I knew the ending would be worth waiting for. When the board reconvened, the air had changed. Not dramatically. Corporate justice rarely arrives on horseback. It arrives in measured language, follow-up reviews, and the sudden disappearance of a certain kind of confidence. Dana resumed her seat and folded her hands. "We have a few additional questions before we conclude." That sentence was velvet over a blade. The next 20 minutes were not loud, which made them devastating. The board asked about disclosure standards, oversight, approval authority, and whether financial controls had been bypassed in substance, if not in form. Mina answered the legal pieces. Jonah covered audit trail integrity. I addressed forecasting methodology and escalation memos. Every answer was clean, documented, and boring in the most lethal way possible. Sella tried one final maneuver. "This division has delivered strong growth for years. It would be a mistake to reduce a complex quarter to a handful of disputed emails." Ruth did not even blink. "These are not disputed emails. These are your approvals." I almost wanted to frame that sentence. Then Dana requested that Sella and I step out while the board deliberated. And we waited in the adjoining lounge where the furniture was soft enough to suggest compassion and expensive enough to discourage it. Sella stood near the window. I sat and reviewed my notes, not because I needed to, but because it denied her an audience. Finally, she turned. "You think this makes you a hero?" I looked up. "No, I think it makes me accurate." She gave a brittle laugh. "You have no idea how this level works." That one almost touched a nerve. Mostly because women like her say it as though competence is a gated community and they own the key. "I know enough," I said, "to avoid signing my own warnings and then blaming the person who wrote them." She stared at me, and in that moment I understood something useful. She had not framed me because I was weak. She had chosen me because I was reliable. Reliable women make convenient shields. We keep records. We solve messes. We assume facts will protect us. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they need a little stage lighting. A board assistant appeared and asked us back in. Dana spoke first. "Effective immediately, the board is initiating an independent governance review of the outpatient division. Pending that review, approval authority for major operational expenditures will be reassigned." A pause. "Dr. Voss, you are being placed on administrative leave." Even now, I can remember how quiet that landed. No gasps, no dramatic collapse, just a sentence. Clear and expensive. Sella held her face together with visible effort. "On what basis?" Dana answered without ceremony. "Failure of candor to the board, misrepresentation of internal financial escalation, and compromised oversight." There are moments when revenge does not feel hot. It feels cool. Precise. Like setting down a glass after a long thirst. Then Dana turned to me. "Liv, the board appreciates the quality of your documentation and your restraint." Restraint. What a lovely corporate word for not flipping a table. She continued. Until further notice, you will report jointly to the interim divisional lead and the chief financial officer. We would also like your recommendations on improved escalation governance. There it was. Not applause. Better. Authority. I thanked the board and kept my voice even. Inside, my pulse was dancing in high heels. The meeting ended. Directors gathered their papers and filed out. Ruth paused beside me and said, very quietly, "You did not defend yourself. You established the record. More women should learn that difference." I smiled. I intend to teach it. In the hallway, Mina caught up with me. Lunch? Yes. Somewhere with linen napkins, she said. Justice deserves texture. We had nearly reached the elevator when Sella emerged from the boardroom with her bag and a face carved from humiliation. For 1 second I thought she might say something dramatic. She did not. She looked at me, then at the folder in my hand. "I underestimated you," she said. I pressed the elevator button. That was expensive. The weeks after the meeting were full of whispers, policy drafts, and the sort of concerned emails that begin with phrases like, "in light of recent developments." Corporate scandal has seasons: shock, distancing, reform, and then the inevitable panel discussion about lessons learned by people who missed every lesson in real time. I was too busy to enjoy the theater for long. The chief financial officer asked me to co-lead a controls redesign for the division. Mina helped structure board reporting standards that separated narrative commentary from source-verified financial analysis. Jonah built a cleaner approval matrix so no senior leader could bury a risky decision under decorative language and vague delegation. For the first time in months, I was not cleaning up after leadership. I was helping design guardrails around it. That, for me, was the real payoff. Not because I am noble. I enjoy a good downfall as much as the next exhausted woman in a blazer. But the sweetest revenge is not watching someone fall. It is making sure they cannot use the same trap on the next woman. One afternoon, sometime later, Dana asked me to join her for coffee in the executive lounge. She did not waste time on pleasantries. "You are being considered for vice president of operational finance," she said. I set down my cup carefully. "That is a serious step." "It is," she said. "So is being the only person in that room who understood that facts do not need raising voices." I thought about that. About the years I had spent being useful but not visible, sharp but agreeable, trusted with problems and left out of power. There is a quiet tax many women pay in corporate life. We are expected to absorb strain gracefully, correct mistakes invisibly, and accept that recognition will come later. Later is a lovely place where many careers go to die. "I would take the role under conditions," I said. Dana raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Direct access to the board audit committee on material variance issues, written escalation protections for finance staff, mandatory documentation on executive override decisions, and annual training for senior leadership on fiduciary duty, records integrity, and retaliation risk." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You negotiate like a lawyer." "I work near enough of them to have learned survival." She nodded. "Draft it." That evening, I left the building under a sky turning gold behind the towers. My phone buzzed with a message from my older sister B, asking whether I was still coming to Sunday dinner and whether I could explain, in normal language, what a trust actually did because her husband kept pretending he understood estate planning. I laughed out loud on the sidewalk. There it was. The whole point of everything. Numbers at work, protections at home, signatures, rights, records, leverage. Women are told to be trusting as daughters, wives, employees, caretakers. Then the bill arrives. Financially, legally, emotionally. I had spent 1/4 being positioned as the convenient scapegoat. I ended it with a promotion track, structural reforms, and a reputation that no one could staple to their mistakes. A month after the board meeting, when I heard Sella had retained counsel and was disputing the terms of her exit, of course she was. Women like her never lose quietly. Still, her name was now attached to governance review findings, not my forecast files. Reality had chosen its owner. Sometimes people ask how I stayed calm in that room. The truth is, calm was never surrender. Calm was strategy in a silk blouse. I did not need to win with an outburst. I needed the record, the board, and the timing. She arrived with a story, and I arrived with evidence. Only one of us left with credibility.